In 1997, the leadership of this congregation, the search committee, called Diane and I to be here as the co-pastors. We had followed a wonderful ministry with Brother John, who had been the minister here for 27 years. And when he retired, the leadership wanted to go in a new direction. And in those days, a clergy couple was very unique, and women as a senior pastor was unique. You have to remember this was some time ago. And so there was a difficulty for some people in this congregation to have a woman as a senior pastor or as a clergy couple. And after the first couple of years of finally figuring out that everything was going to be okay, and that this clergy couple was going to follow in the great history of the church, we started to really gain some momentum. Things were changed around. The church gained some new energy. And I remember when the Cincinnati Enquirer came and interviewed us because they were surprised that a progressive Christian church in a conservative area could be growing like it was. And I said to the reporter, just don't use the L word. And they said, lesbian? I said, no, you're okay, because we were welcoming the LGBTQ community, and that was part of why we were coming and growing as a congregation. I said, no, don't use the L word, liberal. That would be the death march. Because to be a liberal congregation back in those days, when conservative Christianity was really the hallmark for people in this area. And of course, when the article came out in the Cincinnati Enquirer, it said, liberal congregation welcomes active gay and lesbians. Now, one of the members of the congregation who was gay said, it said active gay and lesbians. I haven't been active for 5 years. Can I still come to church? I said, yes, you can. But what happened with that article was it really called us to come out. I said, you've been called out of the closet, if you will, because there were some people in the congregation who were afraid, like, well, my friends now know that I go to a church that welcomes gay and lesbians. I go to a church that has a woman as the senior pastor. And there were some people who were really kind of afraid that their friends might alienate them. And so they were, they hadn't told people that they went to a church like this. And I said, it's called you now to claim who you are and not to apologize for it, but to celebrate it. Well, what happened was we had people coming from 30 miles from a distance to come to this church because they wanted their children to be in a congregation that celebrated all of humanity, that celebrated who we were as people of God. And so there was this whole sense of movement that came into the church. And the church really claimed its own. And now, as we see, as we left, you called Pastor Susan as your senior pastor. And it's a wonderful celebration what this church has continued to do. That sense of courage that it took to take a new direction and to call out to a new way when people were resisting was exactly what Jeremiah was feeling. And we had some sacred rebels in this congregation who led the congregation in a new direction. And I think Jeremiah was that sacred rebel. You have to remember, in the context of that time, King Solomon, when he stepped down, there was the whole country of Israel. Israel was this one country, but then it became divided. And you had the northern kingdom, which was Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was Judah. The Babylonians had come and which was Iraq today, they had invaded and taken over the northern kingdom, and there was no more Israel. It was just the southern Judah where Jerusalem was. Jeremiah was a prophet, and the people in Judah had really lost their focus with God. They started worshiping other gods. They started focusing on the military more because they were threatened. And Jeremiah was calling them back to be in relationship to God and to honor God and to lift God up in their lives and in the country. And so as Jeremiah came into Jerusalem, he thought the chief priest would celebrate and would honor him and let him have a voice. But actually, as Jeremiah was giving his word about repenting and coming back to God in a stronger way, the chief priest had him beaten and had him pushed aside because he didn't want this rabble-rouser, this rebel, to disturb things and disturb the status quo. And so Jeremiah was in this place where he was beaten down, he was told to be quiet, and then that's when you hear these words from Jeremiah. Let me read those again to you. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. This was not just an idea or a point of view. He said it was in his core being. To be faithful, he had to speak out. He had to lift up this and call this out to the community. Now, many of us have not been, will never be up against kings or a chief priest, but there are different times when we are called and invited to be sacred rebels ourselves. I remember, in fact, Jim and Glenna Galbraith, long-term members of this congregation, their daughter Shannon, who was just in high school at that time. It was 1987. So you have to remember, 40 years ago, Shannon was this really athlete, wanted to play soccer, but there was no girls' soccer teams at all in Boone County. Jim and Glenna Galbraith went to the superintendent, to the council, and said, we need to have a girls' soccer team for our county and for our high school here. Now you can imagine there probably was some pushback. We don't need to do this. The girls know their place. We don't have money for this. But they did this respectfully, but they challenged the status quo. And of course, we now know we have girls soccer all through Boone County and all around our high schools. They were sacred rebels in that way. And I think that's what's important for us to realize, that to be a sacred rebel doesn't mean we have to be loud and strong, but it might be in subtle ways that we can be with the fire in our bones that just calls us, we must say something. We must do something in this way. That's why I wrote this book, Sacred Rebel, Fierce Love in a Fearful World, because I wanted people to first be able to find their own voice, what they believed, that connection to the divine, and then how do we engage in the world as a sacred rebel, not as a mean rebel, not as a rebellious rebel, because today it seems like everybody wants to be over against one another. If we watch the social media, it's almost mean-spirited. And people on both sides politically call out the other people, and all it does is make the other people harden, make their hearts harden more, and they become over against one another. Jesus was much about building bridges, being inclusive, how we could find a way to have everyone at the table. It's what this church has lived out and modeled, continues to live out. And being that sacred rebel today is needed more than ever, because we see this polarization and we see this separation over against, and it's a way of saying, I respect you. You might have a different point of view than me. Help me understand that point of view. I was in speech and theater in college, and I loved to debate. And I was always going to make my point, and I could convince somebody. And when Diane and I met in seminary, I loved her because she was a strong woman. And when we got married, I liked it how she stood up for her point of view, except when she stood up against me, And I'd say, now this, and she'd say, Jerry, that's your point, but there's more than one point of view. And she helped me realize there's different ways to come at it. And it was humbling to me that I had to learn to listen. I had to learn to realize, yes, there was more than just my point of view to resolve this, and actually to have a different perspective on things. Can you imagine if we had that type of respect and listening to each other? That's the hope that I think we want to encourage and we want to model. Listening to another creates that for one another. Maybe it's being they're in a room, in a boardroom, or in a meeting that you're in, and the person who's leading the meeting is just ignoring somebody's point of view. Somebody's trying to say something, and they're shutting them out. And maybe you just say, I want to hear that person's point of view. They have something to say too. Or maybe you're with somebody who people are making fun of, or they're different than what people are doing, and you just be able to come over and stand by them. You know, the sense of joining together with people who are different than us is challenging at times. And some of us, you know, we don't want to be out in the light because we're afraid of what will happen to us. But it can happen in subtle ways, maybe around the table, being in conversation. In 1989, my first church was an Augusta Christian church. I was a senior pastor, and we had an interfaith group with a Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and a Baha'i there in Indianapolis, Indiana. And we met on a monthly basis for lunch, an hour luncheon. We all were very cordial and trying to be on our best behavior and look with one another, but we really didn't know each other. And so I invited Dr. Shahid Attar from the Muslim faith, Rabbi Boxman from the Jewish faith, and Hamilton Ness from the Baha'i to come to my house for dinner. And they all agreed. And I remember calling Diane and said, guess who's coming to dinner? It was so interesting because that evening I was a little nervous having these people, and I mean, I didn't know anything about Muslims or Islam or that much about the Jewish faith, but I remember when Dr. Shahid Attar came, and I didn't know that Muslims prayed 5 times a day. And this was sunset, and he wanted to have his evening prayer. And he had brought along his prayer cloth. And he had said, Jerry, could I just go back off to the side and do my prayers? And he laid his prayer down, cloth down. I said, could we pray with you? And he kind of lit up. Well, yes. So the men got all in a row, and the women got in a row. And we were there, and I'm watching Dr. Attar, and his face is going up like this. Well, we had a cat named Max that was 25 pounds. As soon as he put that prayer cloth down, Max saw it and came rolling on the cloth because, you know, he wanted to see how that felt. Now, as Dr. Attar is like this, I'm seeing Max, and I'm going, And just as Dr. Shahid Attar bends down, Max moves. Thank goodness. Christ is averted. So we all kneel. We do the prayer. We get up. And then Rabbi Boxman says, well, I want to do a prayer too. Okay. So he prays. Then Hamilton Ness says, well, I want to pray too. And then I said, well, I might as well do a prayer in the Christian tradition. So after a half hour of prayers, we're ready for the meal. It's kind of cold, but we still had it. But really what happened was so sacred because we started to realize we had so much more in common than what divided us. We talked about our family and our kids. We talked about our own beliefs and in our churches, and we learned about each other. And no longer was somebody just from a picture or some media description about this faith tradition. Now we became people, human beings to one another. And I realized that what happened was that right after that, there was a war in the Middle East. Operation Desert Storm happened. And there were many of the Muslims who were living in Indianapolis who were being threatened. And there were bomb threats against the mosque and against the children in high school. And so we stood in solidarity. And we decided we would go out and say, we know these people. They're American citizens. They've lived here a long time. And they love the United States. And we stood with them. We couldn't have done it if we didn't know who they were, but now we were in relationship. And the power of standing in solidarity made them feel like they were not alone. And it put some risk at us. I had some people in my own church who left the church. Didn't think that I should be doing it. I had phone calls from Christian ministers who said I should be trying to convert them rather than trying to stand with them. But I felt I needed to follow Jesus' teachings of loving my neighbor and being a place of love and hope. When we moved to First Christian Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, They had a going away party for us. And Dr. Attar came, and he gave me his prayer cloth. I said, "This is your prayer cloth, Dr. Attar." He says, "No, you must have this. Your friendship is engraved upon my heart." I kept this with me all these years because it reminds me how powerful a meal can be. Welcoming somebody to your home or welcoming them into a relationship, getting to know them is what Jesus called us to do. So I ask you, are there sacred rebels here within us? Is God calling you to maybe build bridges with someone or some community? Is God calling you maybe to speak up where you have felt silent? May you know the power of God's love and the courage that God brings to us to live out our lives with fierce love and courageous compassion. Amen.